Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ware, for being here. I know you're from the Virgin Islands, but I understand you have some family in the great Commonwealth of Kentucky, so two great places there. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for the incredibly important work that your office carries out to protect the Small Business Administration, and in this case, taxpayer dollars. We're here today talking about fraud that happened during the pandemic and fraud and pandemic relief programs. So I'm glad that you have an opportunity to talk about what kind of fraud controls work and how we can recover fraudulent loans issued during the pandemic. No one on this committee wants money going out to fraudulent businesses or fraudulent lenders. So I also want to take a second to set the stage and remember what it was like when the pandemic started. That this was an unprecedented program where, we were putting together things literally in 2 weeks and saying we've got to get money out to these businesses. I know the businesses in my community, many of whom got this money, and that's why they are still here today. Between the Biden and Trump administrations, the SBA stood up programs and issued over $1 trillion of loans. And according to the SBA's analysis, only a small percentage of that money went to fraudulent buyers. According to your analysis, even a vast, vast majority of it went to people who needed it. Just this week, I met with Headliners Music Hall in my office as they were up here on another issue. Headliners Music Hall would not be here today if it weren't for a successful program like this that enabled this business to be here. These programs saved our economy, and they saved the businesses in our communities that we cherish. There are some bad actors that took advantage of this, and we've got to make sure we go after them. But as you've already testified today, the vast majority of the fraud took place in the first 9 months, and I'll point this out, of 2020. So between March of 2020 and January of 2021. Who was the small business administrator at that time, Mr. Ware?
What was it?
It wasn't Miss Guzman, was it?
No.
No, it wasn't? Okay.
Yes.
Was it Miss McMahon?
Carranza. No.
No, it wasn't?
It was Carranza.
Ms. Carranza. I guess there's an empty seat here for them too, because they're not here to answer why all this fraud took place under their watch. And so I'm glad you point that out. Mr. Ware, the SBA analyzed the EIDL repayment data and reported that 74% of COVID EIDL borrowers already made a payment. And once the 30-month deferral period lapses, the SBA expects 85% of borrowers will have made a payment. This information contradicts your findings that $136 billion worth of COVID EIDLs are potentially fraudulent. Why didn't you take into consideration the repayment data, which would have lowered your estimate of fraud in the EIDL program?
Let me say two things about that. That data that you're talking about, they gave that to us probably like 2 days prior, and then came with the other information after. But so repayment data for us was not a factor for EIDL. It's a factor for PPP, where those loans were intended to be forgiven and basically become a grant. So if you don't come back for forgiveness, or you don't try to, and don't try to repay, clearly that's an indicator. Within EIDL, we're arresting people almost daily that are making payments. So our criminal investigative investigations across the nation are telling us that fraudulent actors do repay those loans, and we know why. They could be like businessmen that fraud is their thing, right? So they're conducting business and they're paying the loans back, never to be found. Also in the plea agreements, to try to get to show good faith to U.S. attorneys and everything else, people pay their loans. And with all the publicity that this is getting, that we're coming, and that there's a whole of government approach to this, people pay so as not to be discovered.
And I'm glad you bring that up, because again, we want to go after the fraudulent actors. We want to make sure that we're getting this money back if it was used inappropriately, particularly by people who are taking advantage of a successful program during a time we needed it. So the vast majority of the fraud took place during the Trump administration, and in 2021, Administrator Guzman and the Biden administration reinstated the longstanding anti-fraud controls and new safeguards, while also reviewing the previously answered loans flagged as fraudulent. Can you take a moment to just let us know, are these security measures like the SBA's four-part anti-fraud control, are they being effective, and are they combating fraudulent borrowing since their implementation?
We do know that it has curbed the tide. To what extent, we're still reviewing that. And we have reviews that are coming to an end real shortly on exactly how those controls performed. More importantly, if the controls promised were indeed implemented as they promised.
And thank you. I appreciate that. In our closing comments, I appreciate you being here. And, this is a committee that works together to stop activity like this. I hope your presence here today is not a partisan attack on the administrator.